Welcome to Environmental Law Explored, a podcast series. The podcast of the American Bar Association section of Environment, Energy, and Resources. SEER is a member organization whose mission is to foster the success of a diverse community of environmental, energy, and resources lawyers, advisors, law students, and decision makers, and provide a premier forum for the exchange of ideas and information.
My name is Elias Kohn, and I'm with the Forest Resources Committee of the American Bar Association and an attorney at the firm of Kohn, Swift & Graff in Philadelphia. During this episode, you'll hear about prescribed fire, also known as controlled burning, which has created recent legal and policy debates, especially in New Mexico, where prescribed fire escaped control and created the state's largest wildfire. And this episode's panelists work for the United States Forest Service and are involved at leadership levels with prescribed fire and wildfire efforts. Welcome and good morning to both of you.
Good morning.
Could you please start us off by sharing your names, job positions, and connection to fire efforts?
So this is Steve Hattenbach, and I will start out and then hand it over to Anthony. But my name is Steve Hattenbach. I am the Forest Supervisor for the Cibola National Forest and grasslands. That's a little bit less than 2 million acres spread from Gallup, New Mexico, all the way out to Cheyenne, Oklahoma. And I've been the forest supervisor here for about 5 years. I've fulfilled a number of roles for the Forest Service over the years. Part of my past background includes 20 years in the practice of law. I am a member of the New Mexico Bar. I was an attorney for the USDA Office of General Counsel, which means I was an attorney for the Forest Service for about a decade here in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And I've also worked for state and local government in the past. And so my involvement with prescribed fire has involved not only being legal counsel for the agency, but now being what is called an agency administrator, the individual responsible for approving a prescribed fire or not. Anthony.
Yeah, good morning, Rob. My name's Anthony Martinez. I also work here on the Cibola National Forest, here at the supervisor's office. My background's a little different. I've worked the last 27 years in different areas. Started out on a hotshot crew at the ground level, and then kind of worked out through the pathway, trying to work my way up through management, kind of a district AFMO, district FMO, and currently fields program manager here at the SO.
Before we jump into more details, when we use the term prescribed fire or controlled burning, what exactly does that mean, and how does that differ in your use of that term from when someone, for instance, says a wildfire?
So this is Steve, so I'll start. Prescribed fire is a term we use. Now, historically, there have been other terms. You may hear it referred to as a controlled burn. It is where we plan and intentionally set a fire with the plan and intention to achieve natural resource management goals. And the reason for that is many of our forests, particularly many of our western forests, evolve to coexist and flourish with frequent fire in the ecosystem. Fire rejuvenates the soil, recycles nutrients, clears out underbrush and decadent growth, and is a healthy part of the natural balance of the ecosystem. And prescribed fire is when an agency, a federal agency, such as the one I work for, the U.S. Forest Service, intentionally designs and plans one of those fires to mimic the natural processes that existed for many millennia to introduce fire on that landscape and stimulate those resource benefits from prescribed fire. It also serves an important purpose to reduce hazardous fuels in and around our communities, particularly here in the Western United States, where you've had decades of growth without a natural fire regime taking place. Now, a prescribed fire is something that takes years to plan and implement with a host of specialists, including decision makers, biologists, fire management specialists, etc. A wildfire or an unplanned fire can be human caused or natural caused. The majority of unplanned ignitions are actually human caused. That's why our mascot for many, many decades has been Smokey Bear, who tries to encourage folks to manage fire and ignition responsibly. We also have many natural causes of wildfire, particularly lightning. Lightning was traditionally one of the most common natural sources of ignition of a wildfire. Most recently, those often occur in situations which have become damaging and difficult to control. That has to do with many, many decades of fire suppression and accumulation of hazardous fuels. And so we use prescribed fire as something of a relief valve. We're trying to mimic this natural process of fire to recycle nutrients, and where we particularly have an accumulation of hazardous fuels. Managing it under our terms can result in a more beneficial outcome, a more controllable outcome than a wildfire that may occur at a very inopportune time, very difficult to control time.
So with the prescribed fire, one thing I wanted to mention is that you might hear prescribed fire or controlled fire. We use that term relative. A lot of people might say one or the other, but it basically means the same thing. But prescribed fire it's basically a prescription that we set under controlled environmental parameters. It's kind of like a recipe. If you're baking a pie or something, or cake, you're going to be putting certain ingredients into that. And again, it's very specific parameters, usually the weather, and those are kind of our constraints that we work at, our parameters that we work against, sidebars. So again, it's very controlled. Anytime we get close to those parameters or exceed them, we stop and reevaluate. A lot of science behind it, a lot of modeling that we do to come up with those prescriptions. And then on the wildfire side, I wanted to also mention that Steve did mention Smokey Bear in that campaign. A lot of our fires have been suppressed starting early 1900s. We started doing suppression, and that's really contributed to a lot of the problem that we have today. Kind of building up the fuels in the forest. Just have really thick areas where they call them doghead thickets, where it's just thick stuff you can't even walk through. And that's contributed to the problems that we're having today. We're dealing with that issue.
So Anthony, on the topic of policies around fire suppression, in other words, of policies of actually putting out fires since the 1900s, which is now shifting with controlled fire, does climate change also add to this issue around forest management now of both accumulated fuels and climate change at work?
Absolutely. That is just recently we went through a prescribed fire review, and that was one of the findings is drought and climate change. And so we are going back to the board, and we're trying to figure out how to better manage, wildfires and prescribed fires with climate change. It's a big factor that I think everybody's dealing with, and it does affect fire behavior, affects the way, we deal with safety, putting people in certain places. We never used to deal with the temperatures that we're dealing with today. The winds, just the fuels out there are very dry, susceptible to fire ignition. And yeah, all those things add up to a recipe for fire growth, large fire growth.
So this is Steve, and I'll talk about climate change a bit. Long-term climate change is one of many factors that affect wildfire behavior, opportunities for prescribed fire, and just in general, natural resource management on the forests. In addition to long-term climate change, which here in the Southwest generally has the effect of drying and warming trends, we also have periodic drought, along with normal weather cycles, what we call El Nino, La Nina here in the Southwest. It's our cyclic monsoon periods, our wet and dry years. And all those combine with all the other natural factors out there, like insect and disease. And so you see this additive effect of a forest that has had long-term fire suppression and maybe is thicker than it would naturally be in the past. And Anthony referred to dog hair thickets. Generally, what that looks like is a lot of young trees that would have been cleared out with episodic fire. For example, in a ponderosa pine forest, very common in Southwest, right? Every 20 to 40 years, or sort of depending, you might see a low-level ground fire clean out some of those young saplings, make room for growth for those that survived. You see that forest stressed with a lot of saplings, impacted by episodic drought, those normal La Nina, El Nino cycles, so you have those dry years. On top of that, you have the long-term trend of drying and warming here in the Southwest, and that facilitates outbreak of insect and disease, right? You may see another life cycle of a bark beetle or a really high population level in a moth that's defoliating some of these trees. And it just sets this very peak extreme circumstance where not only can wildfires rage, but they can overcome our ability to contain and suppress them. Over the past decade or so, I've been very actively involved in wildfire. Every year, you hear someone say, I've never seen that before. I've never experienced those conditions before. And every year, it seems to be something new. Fires that used to routinely not burn over a continental divide have in recent years. Fuel types that traditionally only burn once every century, wet aspen, certain high altitude mixed conifer, with no fire history, now become available, which is the term of art. They become available and are burnt by these wildfires. And so it just seems like every year we have some very seasoned wildfire professional, some with 20 years of experience, say, I've never seen that before. And I think that's the anecdotal sign of long-term climate change. It's compounded by annual cycles of drought, by these episodic cycles of El Nino, La Nina, but certainly long-term climate change is affecting the forests out there, affecting wildfire behavior. And as Anthony said, it's a factor that specifically was called for to look at in greater detail in our prescribed fire planning, this effect of, long-term drought, soil moisture, vegetation moisture, and how it affects our opportunities for healthy prescribed fire.
Can prescribed fire make firefighting efforts more achievable? Or for instance, in your experience on fire crews or as a hotshot or on incident command, were there times where previous areas that had a prescribed fire made fighting a wildfire more doable?
Yes. The answer to that is yes. And I've seen the effects of prescribed fire and wildfire as it has assisted in firefighting efforts in later years. A simple saying, the only thing that stops a big fire is a small fire. You will see fire behavior moderate and give us the ability to control. We talk about resistance to control as one of our factors in firefighting. And you will see that when a wildfire hits a prior burn or prescribed burn or a former fire scar from wildfire, that you see fire behavior moderate and reduces the resistance to control that firefighters face. And there's a simple fact behind that. Prescribed fire and a wildfire reduces the fuel loading on the ground, right? All that dead and down timber, the underbrush and grass. If a prescribed fire can eliminate some of that, then when a wildfire comes through, there's simply less fuel burning. And Anthony can talk about this more, but there are certain behaviors that make a wildfire very difficult to control. Wind is one of those. Long-range spotting is one of those. If a fire is able to gain access to the canopy, you can see an increase in long-range spotting as needles, pine cones, the tips of branches blow off and travel in the wind. And so what a firefighter wants to do, right, is keep those flame lengths low, try and keep it out of the canopy, reduce mortality of the trees, and promote more of a healthy fire, low to moderate severity along the ground. Once it goes up into the canopy, your potential for long range spotting, for those embers to travel distances and leapfrog over firefighters and control lines increases significantly. And so prescribed fire can really reduce that amount of underbrush, that dead and down fuel on the ground, and promote more of a healthy fire behavior. And Anthony, I don't know if you got anything to add about your personal experience with wildfires hitting a burn or a fire scar.
Yeah, I do. Just a couple things. I agree with Steve. Wildfire or prescribed fires. Yeah, we go in there. We basically take away the extra fuel loading in there, and then we try to follow up with whether it's thinning and then prescribed burns. That reduces the fuel loading in there, the amount of trees that's in there, whether it's on the ground or standing. We can kind of focus on both of those. Whether they're small trees, we can do a prescription to target those that kill the small trees, or we can burn what's on the ground as far as the dead fuels. But it lowers the intensities in the fire behavior that you'll find in those burn units. And I've seen several times where, just by doing that, that gives us extra response time to get in there and safely engage with the fire. Whereas if you have a natural ignition and there's no type of treatment, you go in there, you're dealing with torching trees and lots of fire intensities, a lot of dead and down and active fire behavior, which it's not a safe situation. And you really have to take your risk management approach when you're doing that, because like I said, sometimes you just got to wait till you find a different approach, whether it's a road or a natural barrier to engage. But definitely, prescribed fire, definitely, it gives us an edge. It gives us a chance to get in there, and it moderates the fire behavior in general.
That risk management you brought up is a very big topic, because we've heard about the benefits now of prescribed fire. We've heard about controlled settings, but there are also times when prescribed fire, controlled burning becomes uncontrolled, such as what recently happened in New Mexico with Hermit's Peak and Calf Canyon fire. Would you all like to discuss some of that? I know there's a lot of ongoing issues, but even just to give our listeners sort of a bird's eye view of what occurred recently with both of those fires.
So the statistics on this are that federal land management agencies conduct thousands of prescribed fires every year. And they're the end result of multi-year planning processes that try to enhance and preserve natural resources and protect communities from the harmful effects of wildfire. Out of those thousands of prescribed fires every year, a handful will escape. And there's a process for that, to declare a prescribed fire as an escape and to officially declare it a wildfire. And statistically, it's just, it's less than 1%. It's a handful out of thousands. I don't have good statistics on the next statement I'm going to make. I'm going to say it's anecdotal, but the vast majority of escapes are caught relatively quickly with little damage to life or property. And I just say that from talking with folks who've done hundreds and hundreds of burns each, and hundreds of land managers that I've talked to and counsel. If something happens that causes it to escape, the odds are it will be caught relatively quickly. Now, why does it escape? We actually do a declared wildfire review on every prescribed fire that's declared to be an escape, and we publish those. Those are actually available. You could just Google declared wildfire review, look up the facilitated learning analysis we conduct on those, and you will find, common factors in escapes. One of the most common factors is significant wind gusts well above what anyone had predicted, right? Like one of the most common is you're going to find that no one predicted. We got a weather forecast and, spot forecast for the day. It's part of the process that Anthony would go through in doing a prescribed fire. And we have wind velocities that are acceptable in that burn plan for the prescribed fire that we believe it's well controlled in. And just every now and then you cannot predict the weather, and you will see wind gusts that go 20, 25 miles an hour, 30 miles an hour above what was predicted. And that is the most common causal factor for a fire to escape. There are others. I'm not going to downplay the occasional human negligence or some other foul play. There are other factors out there, but that's one of the most common. And most often they are caught. And so from a societal standpoint, you have thousands, tens of thousands of prescribed fires conducted that are protecting hundreds of thousands of homes out there, utility infrastructure, power lines, watersheds, roads, etc. And so there's a huge benefit that society realizes from those thousands and thousands of prescribed fires. Occasionally, one of these escapes is not caught in a timely fashion and does result in significant loss of property or even loss of life. When I talk about this, I usually would talk about the Cerro Grande wildfire as the best known historical example where a prescribed fire went horribly wrong and escaped. And in that situation, it was due to unpredicted, very high wind gusts that spotted fire beyond the control lines. About 20 years happened between that Cerro Grande fire in the early 2000s and Hermit's Peak Calf Canyon, which had eerie similarities of a spring burn in New Mexico and very high wind gusts, unanticipated high winds that caused the fire to spot out of control lines and not be caught quickly. So there is a huge benefit from these prescribed fires, which is why you see continued support for them. If you tally up the uncalculated savings from that to homes and drinking watersheds and power lines and all the other infrastructure we have out there that is protected from future wildfires, and there's a huge benefit from that. I don't want to downplay the fact that you cannot guarantee 100% that all prescribed fires will go according to plan. We can reduce that percentage of escape. It's a tiny fraction of 1%. It's a tiny fraction of that results in significant damage. But we are mimicking a natural process in a very dynamic natural environment. And it would be hard to say nothing will ever go wrong. Nothing will ever be unpredicted in that type of environment. So we continue to see occasional escapes. Again, we're talking handfuls a year out of thousands. Well, and I only have 2 data points, but 20 years apart, we had escapes that were significantly damaging to homes and communities that was really intended to protect, but it went very wrong.
Was there a pause on the use of prescribed fire after the Hermit's Peak Calf Canyon incident?
So after those prescribed fires, Las Despensas prescribed fire escaped and was declared. It was not the only escape that spring across the country. There were other escapes, and Chief of the Forest Service made a determination to pause implementation of prescribed fire for a period of months while they conducted a review of prescribed fire policies and procedures. And that you may hear referred to as the 90-day review. They did put together a large group of experienced professionals who have been working on prescribed fire for most of their career. They did review all the agency policies and procedures around planning fires and implementing fires. And they did implement a number of changes, both to planning of prescribed fire and to implementation of prescribed fire. That's all available from the Forest Service. That 90-day review was made public along with the changes that were made. And that's an ongoing process. They're still continuing to look at best practices that could be implemented today to improve our prescribed fire policies, reduce the number of escapes. Most units have completed their review and returned to prescribed fire. The Cibola National Forest has conducted several fires since, successfully, I might add, here in New Mexico. following those new procedures and policies. And I would say this also occurred after the Cerro Grande fire. The Cerro Grande fire was a National Park Service escape, and there was a review 20 years ago, which established a number of new policies and procedures, which were very successful. But again, we're looking at what changes we can make to reduce that number of only a few escapes, per 1,000. We still like to get that number ever closer to zero and increase the probability that if there were any escape, that it would be caught. For example, one of the changes was to have contingency resources on site, right? And in your burn plan, we always had identified contingency resources, those resources that would be available in case they were spotting outside control lines. Policies have been changed to make sure they are within 30 minutes of the prescribed fire for certain fire complexities. And as a practical matter, that often means they are physically on site, that added capacity to catch any spots outside the control line. That's just one example of something that came out of the 90-day review and our new procedures.
Have there been any suggestions from the public or policymakers about not burning in spring or limiting burns to winter? And if so, what, if any, from the practitioner's perspective here, what, if any, effect might that have on prescribed fire efforts?
Planning a prescribed fire, as I said earlier, involves years of planning. And the professionals who plan this look at a host of factors. And that includes the seasonality. When is it naturally appropriate in this system to burn? When will you have fuel conditions and weather conditions that would promote a natural fire intensity, sort of low to moderate severity intensity that might clean out some underbrush, maybe thin out the saplings, but not destroy the overstory, not get up into the canopy. And there are factors that are looked at like, because fuel moisture, wind speed, wind direction, smoke is one of those. You look at good ventilation and dispersion, so you're not smoking out communities. And when you look at all these factors, you start to narrow down the available times when you can effectively conduct prescribed fire. In the winter, when snow is on the ground, is not a natural time for prescribed fire, right? And in the summer, when it's very, very hot, is one of those seasons when you get the negative effects that you would not want from a prescribed fire. It makes it more likely that you can get fire into the overstory, into the canopy, and reach those uncontrollable conditions. And so historically, the most favorable times to conduct prescribed fire, when you can find those perfect windows where you're getting decent fire effects and not killing the overstory, is in the spring and fall. And that's the traditional burn time for most lands. Burning is in the spring and the fall. And when you take out those times where it doesn't meet those optimal conditions, when the wind is too fast, the wind direction's from the wrong direction, or the wind speeds are too high, you start to limit your windows when you can introduce prescribed fire. And of course, our goal here is to reduce that loading of hazardous fuel, to try and reintroduce a controlled burn to prevent the devastating effects of wildfire when it's in an uncontrolled setting. And if you reduce those windows too much, you run out of an opportunity to effectively reduce hazardous fuels, protect communities. And so that is a big concern with limiting spring burn windows, is that naturally it was one of the times when you would experience wildfire in these ecosystems. We tend to be able to find the right kind of conditions to promote low and moderate severity fire. And if we lose that window, if we lost the spring window, we really limit our opportunity to protect communities and reintroduce more natural conditions in the forest. Now, many folks have raised that concern about spring burning. Traditionally in New Mexico, it's a windy time of the year, and wind was a factor in both Cerro Grande and Hermit's Peak in the growth of those wildfires. So I can understand the concern. There are certain policies and procedures in place to limit burning on red flag days, At some level, when we're in extreme fire conditions, the authority to ignite is elevated, even above my level. So there are policies and procedures in place. But there is a trade-off there. If we lost most of the spring burn window, it would really set us back on our ability to reduce hazardous fuels and protect communities. Anthony, you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. So definitely the spring, I know people look at the spring and they have a lot of concerns with the wind and just the weather in general being pretty severe. But what I'd like to say or add to that as well is that I know Steve talked about, most of the time we try to focus on low to moderate intensity burns, but there are fuel types depending on where you're at. We do have areas like the grasslands that you might have a high severity fire. It's a fast moving, high severity fire, but that's the ecosystem. That's what it calls for. And that's what the prescription that we write up for. So just depending on the time and place, I mean, you might have somebody that says, hey, you guys are burning and it's the spring. But a lot of times, again, the right place, the right time. And sometimes we focus on that grass. Sometimes we focus on a pinyon juniper type that we're trying to kind of kick back, trying to kill off. And sometimes we need a little bit higher severity of a fire to do that. And typically to do that, we need a little bit of wind. And the springtime is sometimes the best time to do that. With all the prescribed fire revisions and reviews and stuff like that, we are definitely, we're revamping our plans. That was part of the requirements. We went to several parts of the burn plans and we addressed certain areas. Some of those were like our holding concerns, contingency resources, having plans for a step-up plan or step-down plan, depending on weather. I can tell you that there was several areas in the burn plans that we went back to and we revised and we basically made sure that we had a real solid plan for those areas. I can say this, most practitioners, most burn bosses, when it comes down to implementing, we'd rather burn in the fall. But again, I don't want to say that it's never the spring. It just depends on the situation.
I would add to this, spring burning, we're trying to mimic the natural process here in a controlled manner. We're trying to release some pressure from the ecosystem. I like to use the analogy of like a soda, carbonated beverage that's under pressure, right? And right now with the buildup of hazardous fuel, we're under a lot of pressure. It's like you've shaken up that soda can, right? You can let it all go at once, which is sort of a wildfire burning under its own terms at a time that it wants. And the analogy there, what the effect is if you shake a soda can and let it pop free. A prescribed fire is releasing that pressure valve, slowly releasing the pressure off the system in a controlled manner at a time and place of our choosing. There are those systems that traditionally burned in the spring during wind events. Pinyon juniper, particularly the more open grassland pinyon juniper, typically would burn, rarely, but would burn with high winds. And you see a lot of encroachment there, more juniper in some of these interspersed meadows and riparian areas where really a higher wind speed is what is called for naturally. And we as a society can choose to do that at a time and place of our choosing, with firefighters on the ground, with the intent to manage it and control it, or nature can do it at a time and place of nature's choosing, which may not be at a time and place where we can effectively contain it. It is not without risk, but it is a management of the risk. We're doing it at a time and place in a manner of our choosing, rather than simply letting nature just pop the top on that soda can with all the pressure.
It's a really helpful analogy. And we're hearing here about seasonal restraints. What about some of the law and policy restraints on prescribed fire? For instance, some of our listeners may have heard that a burn boss was arrested in Oregon recently for work on a fire. Is that something that I imagine has repercussions in other parts of the country besides Oregon for fire managers?
Unfortunately, something like that can have a chilling effect Without getting into the specifics of that case, which I'm not really at liberty to discuss in much detail, what I can say is this is occasionally a risk for federal employees, threat of our actual attempt to enforce state law on a federal employee and their management of federal resources. Traditionally, that has been worked out through legal forums. If you're within the scope of your employment, it's an action of the federal government, and whatever claim there is really against the federal government, not the individual employee. Unfortunately, it's not the only case where a federal employee has been the subject of attempts at really state enforcement of policy questions. I would say, again, that prescribed fire is a very heavily regulated activity. It follows best management practices and a variety of policies and procedures. I thought I'd mention for your listeners, there's a federal manual on this. If you want to Google PMS 484, that is the interagency manual on prescribed fire plans, developing a burn plan. We would go through a public process as part of implementing this. It's called a NEPA process, National Environmental Policy Act process, where we would get comments from the public on these proposals. As an agency action, this is subject to the whole host of federal laws that would apply when implementing a project on federal land, whether that's protecting archaeological sites under the National Historic Preservation Act or air quality regulation. That's another one of these parameters that can restrict your windows, and that's under the Clean Air Act and the relevant state's state implementation plan. There would be requirements for smoke management under those, and we as federal agencies are required to obtain burn permits or a waiver, whatever would be required under that state implementation plan for management of smoke and meeting health-based standards out there. So there's this laundry list of federal laws that apply to planning a prescribed fire and implementing it. There are certain restrictions that Congress or the agency has put in place. For example, I mentioned under certain conditions, the decision to implement a prescribed fire is elevated during what we call planning level 4 and 5, PL 4 and 5, which is when there's a very high level of wildfire response across the country. Those decisions have to be elevated to make sure we have available resources. When the danger rating is at a certain level in the county or adjacent counties of the fire, the decision has to be elevated above my level to the regional forester level. So there are a variety of restrictions in place to make sure it's planned appropriately. Hope that answers your question.
Absolutely. Anthony, was there anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, I think Steve covered that very well, but I think just a couple of points that I'll just kind of add to is I think you mentioned NAAQS, the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, and how that kind of applies to us as far as state regulations, and that all ties into particulate matter. That's kind of the smoke particles in the air that they monitor, and that's one of the thresholds or the policies that we have to stay in line with, and that can be pretty challenging. Just monitoring the air. Sometimes we have air sheds that are protected. Sometimes we have air sheds that are under stricter regulations as well. Albuquerque is an example of that. Bernalillo County has, they have air quality regulation that's actually a higher standard than the state standard. So a lot of times we have to go through those meetings and make sure that we're on the same page or not exceeding their standards. So when it goes down to lighting the match and implementing a burn, it takes quite a few steps, like Steve was saying. It's not just a matter of lighting the match. It's going through the policy, making sure we're within regulations as far as prescribed burning, making sure we have the proper folks involved as far as communication. A lot of times it's reaching out to different agencies that might be affected across boundaries, private land versus state land and government land. And then tying all those in together to make sure you got a good solid plan. And then moving forward with timing. When are you going to do it? Who do you need? Sometimes resources are another constraint. This time of the year, we're shifting resources across boundaries. It could be Arizona, New Mexico. We're coordinating across boundaries to make sure we can shift resources over to accomplish those goals. when you look at the practitioner and you look at all the boxes we have to check, it's quite a process, and a lot of folks that are in that communication line.
So I would add to that, if your listeners are interested, right, in that publication, PMS 484, you see an example burn plan in there, and you have what we call the go, no-go checklist. It's 2A and 2B. Those are the parts of the burn plan. And when it goes through all the applicable federal laws and requirements we follow, you have to check off when you're deciding to ignite a fire or not. There's one both for the agency administrator, my role, and for the burn boss, folks who will be burning out there. A bit of the irony here is that, prescribed fire, an intentionally set fire, is subject to intense management and regulation. Wildfire is not. I'm required to obtain either a burn permit or a waiver, whatever's required for compliance under the Clean Air Act and the state implementation plans, but a wildfire is not. And, very often during wildfire, we see extended periods of health-based advisories for communities downwind from wildfires. And so there's this tension here of, more prescribed fire will help abate those very dangerous wildfires, which are destructive to communities and hazardous to public health. But we are subject to an intense regulatory requirement, which limits our ability to sort of avoid the bad outcomes. It's a tough dance between the regulatory requirements, how you weigh these two. But yeah, prescribed fire is subject to that process. Wildfire, when you have a human-caused ignition that was not intended, right? Someone is careless with a cigarette butt or a campfire, or you have a natural ignition like lightning, it's probably not going to meet those NAAQS, those National Ambient Air Quality Standards, for particulate matter for downstream communities.
It's a great point. I can't think of many comparable analogies where we have this tool in prescribed fire to reduce wildfire risk. And then we have that tool itself poses a risk, so it's heavily regulated. But then the more we regulate in some ways, we may limit its ability to reduce those future risks of wildfires. And for the lawyer policymakers thinking about these issues, I can't really think of a great analogy of another environmental law topic like that. But the same reasoning, I think, applies to some of the litigation that's happening and the need to compensate the victims of either wildfires or prescribed fire. I'm curious your thoughts on that, or even your thoughts on some of the litigation, on Hermit's Peak, whether that's taking claims or Federal Tort Claims Acts, and what if any effect that might also be having on prescribed fires.
So I'm a bit of a historian too, and I like to think about the history of our society's relationship with fire. Fire's had a natural role in these landscapes for many, many millennia, and was actively used by traditional peoples, by Native Americans in North America for various purposes. It was a part of traditional grazing in the Southwest hundreds of years ago to, burn fields, burn meadows at the end of grazing season to rejuvenate growth. I'd say our society developed a different relationship with fire 100 years or so ago. And there were some factors around that. There is a very large, very destructive group of fires. You may hear it referred to as the Big Burn, which was in the northern part of the U.S., Montana, Idaho area. There were other very destructive wildfires in and around those decades, and really gelled a public view of fire as something to be stopped at all costs, that its only benefit was destructive. And in popular culture, I point to Bambi, in the original Disney cartoon, and the very destructive view of wildfire on the natural environment that came out of that cartoon. And so we adopted policies as a society really for 100% suppression. And we're not recognizing the beneficial and natural role of fire in the environment or natural processes. And I think over the last century, we've learned a little bit. And but yet our public policy is still catching up with that. Many states used to have as a state law absolute liability for any escaped fire from one private land to another. And you may still find that littered throughout state statutes, this sort of strict liability regime for any escaped fire. I will say that a lot of states have been adopting friendlier state laws when it comes to prescribed fire. And you will see a trend in state law of a gross negligence standard. And that really is there to promote and encourage private landowners to adopt sort of best practices in terms of prescribed fire on their landscapes, and to only attach liability if there was gross negligence in implementation of a burn. For example, some states that in recent years adopted a gross negligence standard is the state of California and the state of New Mexico, right? It's not there in all states. And there are surveys out there of state law that have sort of tracked this trend over recent decades as we've been adopting more use of prescribed fire as a necessary tool to manage our communities in these forested landscapes. How that policy will, percolate through all the various federal statutes and regimes, I don't think we've seen the end of that. We've talked about the context of the Clean Air Act and our desire to have healthy air for our communities, desire to meet national ambient air quality standards. Where's the correct trade-off between starting fires that protect the communities and trying to limit that duration of exceedance of NACs? That's something Congress can get to decide if they want to change that balance point. But we have seen it in other legal areas where we're recognizing we need to implement more prescribed fire. And so the best example I can give are the states that really have seemed to be out in front, changing legal regimes around fire and changing the liability laws from what was often strict liability to a gross negligence standard for prescribed fire. Now, the states have the opportunity here to test out a new balance point, right? Under the Clean Air Act, they have state implementation plans, and each state has a slightly different plan. Here in New Mexico, right, we have a locality that has delegated authority, and that's Bernalillo County. So we're subject to two different regulators, and that's not too uncommon across the U.S. to have a couple different regulatory bodies. So there is an opportunity out there if folks want to play around with that balance point to work it through the state implementation plan. I would not have the hubris to say where the right balance point would be, but I do think it's a topic to consider as we work through changing society's view around prescribed fire from 100% suppression and 100% antagonistic relationship to viewing and understanding fire as a natural part of the landscape that is often beneficial, or at least a necessary evil that we must live with. And how do we change the laws to regulate that? You asked a question about the litigation surrounding Hermit's Peak, Calf Canyon. And without going into too much detail, as I'm not going to get into too much detail on that ongoing litigation, I can say there were parallels to the Cerro Grande wildfire from 20 years ago. As I said before, the vast majority of prescribed fires go according to plan. A few out of 1,000 escape. Some small number of those escapes result in damage to property or injury to individuals. And the traditional method to seek recompense, to seek damages out of the federal government, is the Federal Tort Claims Act. And I expect many of your listeners are familiar with Federal Tort Claims Act and the agency processes that allow for filing of those tort claims against an agency and potentially collection of those. That's a whole administrative process that if denied, an individual can then go to federal court and litigate as a tort. There are a number of defenses associated with the Federal Tort Claims Act. There are statute of limitations and time periods for filing. I'm not going to go into a great amount of detail on those, but that traditionally has been the way that an individual aggrieved party would seek compensation from the federal government related to a prescribed fire. When Cerro Grande occurred and there were many hundreds of individuals affected, Congress passed a special compensation law. And that was administered by FEMA. And the intent behind that law was to streamline and simplify the tort claims process. Clearly, having many hundreds of thousands of individuals file tort claims over the same event could be cumbersome, both for the individuals and the time included and for the agencies. And so Congress passed a streamlined compensation law. After Hermit's Peak Calf Canyon, Congress again passed a similar law. The Hermit's Peak Calf Canyon Assistance Act, that is not administered by the Forest Service, that's administered by FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Agency. And that does allow for aggrieved individuals to file claims under the streamlined process, which the intent would be that it's quicker and easier than the Federal Tort Claims Act process, both for those individuals filing claims and for the government, which has to process those many, many thousands of claims, which would be expected. That's not the only way an individual can seek recovery. I believe under those FEMA regulations, which were interim final regulations, which I think are out on the street right now, an individual could decide to follow the federal tort claims process if they felt that was advantageous. We have seen some novel litigation come out of Hermit's Peak Calf Canyon, and that involves a small number of litigants filing really a taking suit under the Tucker Act against the agency in the Court of Claims, seeking recovery as a takings of property. Whether that novel claim will succeed or not will be subject to litigation. And all I can really say about that is the Department of Justice recently filed a motion to dismiss that case. It's a public pleading. You can go look it up yourself. The Court of Claims website filed a motion to dismiss that, saying, really, this type of claim must be brought as a tort claim. It really doesn't meet the standard for a taking of property as the federal courts view it. We'll see whether the Court of Claims agrees with Department of Justice on that or not. We'll see if any new law comes out of that. I will say this type of claim has been tried before in the wildfire context, related to emergency response decisions on where and when and how to fight a wildfire. All those claims have been dismissed in the past. One recently came out of the Court of Claims, the U.S. v. Johnson. That decision came out in January, just saying really, emergency response decisions related to fighting wildfire don't correctly lie in takings. They would have to be brought as a tort under the Federal Tort Claims Act. So some novel areas of law around this. And then if your listeners have any questions on that, they should just monitor that Court of Claims case and see what the various parties file and what the court concludes.
So another major topic that we haven't touched on, the wildland-urban interface, referred to as the WUI. Is that something you all could either share some of your experience with fire management, or as well share whether there's any novel policy approaches to how do we allocate risk among the WUI, or how are we going to deal with the fire issue plus the expansion of the WUI?
So housing trends, particularly in the West, have shown increased homes and infrastructure in the WUI over the past few decades, right? This is where a lot of the housing development has occurred, more infrastructure in place. So there's a lot more at risk in these frequent fire ecosystems now than there was historically. You combine that with the natural factors we discussed, like drought, climate change, etc., you have a recipe for more and more value being at risk. It is probably the scariest situation for fire managers and agencies administrators to conduct prescribed fire. If you are making a plan and intentionally burning to reduce hazardous fuels near homes, that's a very stressful situation, right? Because the risk of an escape there is amplified. You have less time and space to capture some spot, something that goes over the line when you got your back against homes. At the same time, you have the most to gain, right? Reducing hazardous fuels in and around valuable assets like homes, infrastructure, etc. That's where you really have the most to gain. That's where you really want your hazardous fuels reduction. You will see multiple tools being used in that situation, like first entry with mechanical treatment, maybe cutting some of the timber and removing it to reduce the fuel on the ground. Perhaps masticating, that is chewing up, like with a rotary drum or some other tool, chewing up that fuel that's on the ground or standing. That has advantages in trying to get fire out of the canopy and reducing fuel loading. That may not be enough. Sometimes we still need to enter with prescribed fire to really introduce the reduction in fuel loading that we need. So it's both the greatest opportunity with gains, and boy, that's the most anxiety producing situation for anyone, whether it's agency administrator, the burn boss out there doing the fire. It's a very tense situation, but increasingly necessary. What I can say is that Congress has recognized this in some regard. Several of the recent statutes passed by Congress, the funding bills, have included substantial sums of money to reduce the wildfire risk. If you would Google wildfire crisis strategy, and U.S. Forest Service will see a host of information out there about what we're doing. There are a variety of national landscapes where we're focusing on fuels reduction, high hazard watersheds, we're focusing federal funding on hazardous fuels reduction, protecting communities. That comes out of both the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and the recent Inflation Reduction Act. There's a lot of work being done by the Forest Service and other federal land management agencies in and around WUI and these high hazard watersheds, key priority landscapes. But it's not a comfortable feeling when you're doing a prescribed fire in and around WUI. You recognize you need to do it, but it's a very tense situation. And so, Anthony, what does it feel like to do a prescribed fire?
Like you said, it's very stressful. I mean, it's as a burn boss, as the practitioner, you really got to make sure that you have your stuff together. Everything has to be double checked, and make sure that communication is a key critical component to everything. I know, like I said, with a lot of the review changes, there's folks that are a little unsure about the future. I mean, we have folks that, as burn bosses, depending on the complexity of the burn, some folks are just saying, hey, I don't want to put myself in this situation. Some folks they're getting liability insurance to cover themselves in case something does happen, because there is a potential for something going wrong. And I know Steve had mentioned about, the WUI. How do we get ahead of that curve? I mean, there's several places that we might treat on the federal side, but then you look at the private side, and sometimes those folks don't want to treat their land. They just don't want to treat it. I know we have certain agreements, certain things in place where we have the ability to actually cross boundaries. One of them is the Wyden Act. That allows us to, cross boundaries, and actually, whether it's interagency or private land, it allows us to go across boundaries and to treat across land like that. And, that's setting up agreements to where we can do that. But sometimes that's a good approach, get the private landowners involved, and, maybe you can stretch that boundary out to where it's more practical on their private property. And I think it's a win-win situation like that. We don't always do that because people they're really personal to their own property, and sometimes they don't want to see us there. But once they see the benefit, or once they see smoke in the air, that's when they're calling us, asking what they can do. Unfortunately, that's the way things happen. People are pretty quiet until something happens in their backyard. And I'm sure that's the same situation up north. People are probably not anticipating something like that. But when that fire bell rings and that smoke's in the air, it changes your perspective.
So I would say the best solution to this is what we call an all lands approach. And that is partnering with state, private, fed, and multiple ownerships. Wildfire doesn't follow property boundaries. It will burn wherever there is fuel. And so that survey line between fed and private or fed and state is irrelevant to the growth of the wildfire. And that's why you would see for many decades now, the approach of land management agencies has been an all lands approach in partnership and collaboration with landowners in the area. And so we do rely quite a bit on our state partners. State of New Mexico and Department of Forestry, they assist us with reaching out to private landowners. We do have the authority under the Wyden Act to conduct burns that include private land within the perimeter or state lands through cooperation with, in our state of New Mexico. Many other states have that same sort of policy and procedure in place. So there are ways that we can all work together on hazardous fuels reduction. And we do quite a bit of that at the Forest Service, working seamlessly across boundaries, both for mechanical fuels reduction and prescribed fire to protect communities and infrastructure. And then when you get to the home itself, to the structures itself that you're trying to protect, there are many guidance documents out there that your listeners could follow, right? If they have a home and it's in a frequent fire system, right? Google FireWise. Implementing FireWise procedures around your home or business is one of the most important things you can do to prevent loss from wildfire. And it's common activities, reducing the amount of hazardous fuel loading right around structures. And they, talk about no flammable material within 30 feet, limiting ground fuels within 100 feet. They're relatively simple actions that folks can take to reduce the probability of homes or businesses being impacted by wildfire. There's also hardening of structures. Some of this are fairly simple things like ensuring the vents on the home have appropriate screens on them so ember wash will not go up into the roof of the house. These firebrands and embers that come off a wildfire can travel a significant distance. If they get into the attic of a house through the wind, they're very likely to ignite that very dry material. And so there's sometimes fairly simple changes that homeowners can make to protect their homes. It's not something the Forest Service could do, right? That's a private action that can be required or encouraged by state and local jurisdictions. What we can do is help treat the landscape, hopefully in a seamless pattern around the WUI, include the private landowners where we can. As Anthony said, not all homeowners are really excited about implementing FireWise procedures around their home, right? It may require some changes to landscaping or natural environment around the home, which is not always compatible with the aesthetic tastes that people have for their homes in these communities. But it does have a significant effect.
As we start to wind down here, I want to end with some thoughts on compensating victims of wildfires or prescribed fire. Litigation can take a long time. Some of the proposals I've seen circulating look like they deal more with addressing infrastructure replacement and not necessarily getting or trying to have victims approach or get closer to where they were before the fire. Have you all either seen formal proposals or maybe sort of informal ideas brainstorming among your colleagues about ways to speed up and improve compensation for those times when prescribed fires do go and escape control?
I think the first tool, right, that Congress implemented here is the Hermsby-Calf Canyon Assistance Act. Really with that intent to streamline the compensation process, both in terms of what's required to be filed and in the timing of the compensation. Under the Federal Tort Claims Act, it would be pretty routine for an agency to wait up to 2 years to begin processing those till all claims were filed. And I think if you look at FEMA's regulations on Hermis Peak Calf Canyon Assistance Act, you'll see that attempt there to streamline, simplify, speed up the process. I don't want to say that is going to fully compensate individuals. The loss of homes and the damage to communities there was the worst I've ever seen. It's very significant. Many of those homes were built generations ago. Many of these homes, we're talking about homes built by a grandfather, a great-grandfather that have been in the family for many generations. Money does not replace a loss like that. But I think Congress tried, right? And I think if you look at the act, discussion around the act, the FEMA regulations, you'll see that attempt there. President Biden made several public statements around the fire at press conferences, and just to sort of paraphrase, urging all federal agencies to use all available authorities to recover these communities, to compensate individuals where allowable. And so you see an all-agency approach there. FEMA has a significant role here and did respond. The Forest Service did where it could. The state of New Mexico is actively engaged in that. I don't know that there's a single answer for how to assist wildfire victims or those who've lost as a result of prescribed fire. It likely would involve sort of an all-hands approach, all agencies using all their available authority. Supplemental funding has come to these forests and communities to try and repair and replace damaged infrastructure. But I'm not sure there's a silver bullet here that fixes it all. That's above my pay grade, right? That's for Congress to decide. I do think they tried the best they could with Assistance Act and supplemental funding to that, and FEMA's working through that. Hopefully we have lessons learned from prior events where we can improve that process. I think the other side of that is reducing the probability of the occurrence. And that is what you see coming out of the Infrastructure Investment Jobs Act and the Inflation Reduction Act, is significant federal funding with a goal of reducing wildfire risk out there for communities. If the majority of our landscapes were treated, and the science around this is that you only need to treat around 40% or so of a landscape to really have that beneficial effect. Think about a chessboard or checkerboard, where maybe you're treating the black squares and not the white squares, right? But a wildfire raging through there would hit to those treated areas and hopefully drop down to a more manageable intensity level. That can be through a mosaic of treatment like the checkerboard. That could be through implementation of fuel breaks, putting a several 100-yard treatment in to protect a community in case a wildfire is coming at it. Different treatment designs work best in different areas. But the more we can treat, the more wildfires will be manageable and the damage to homes and infrastructures less. So I hope that the work we're doing under these recent laws will make it less likely to occur. What to do when it does occur, I'm gonna defer to the wisdom of Congress on how to manage that one. Anthony.
I know Steve had referenced that most fire prescribed fires are successful, but to put a number behind that, 99.84% of our fires are successful. So, going on to what Steve was saying there, our big vision or approach for the future here is to get more done, to get more of those checkerboard filled, to get filled in on those checkerboard patches that he's talking about. And hopefully, like I said, lessen the fire potential in the future going forward. Yeah, if you look at the program as a whole, like I said, it's that 99.84. That's a pretty high standard as far as being successful. But it's that fraction though, when you do have something that is unintentional, that does come out. Sometimes that's what the public remembers us for. It's not the it's not the successful side, but it's the side that, that's unsuccessful. And some people need to see both sides of the scale there, because there's definitely a story to tell behind that.
Well, Anthony, Steve, is there anything else you'd like our listeners to know about either prescribed fire or Forest Service work around prescribed fire?
Well, I would say, the folks implementing prescribed fire they're members of your community. They're your neighbors. They live in and around you. That's who my district employees are. The same way for the other land management agencies. Many of these folks implementing prescribed fire have lived in these areas their whole life. And the reason we conduct prescribed fire is to protect homes and communities, right? This is to reduce hazardous fuels that could damage our drinking watershed, or damage key infrastructure, or damage homes and communities. I think Anthony said it, 99.84% are successful. Of course, our goal is 100%. I think after the 90-day review and implementing these best management practices, we can increase that 99.84%. Maybe it's 99.9% now. In this dynamic natural environment with climate change, it's hard to guarantee 100%. This is all done with best intent to save and protect homes and communities. That doesn't change the fact that statistically, there may still be a bad outcome that does damage the home and community you were trying to protect. So I just want folks to know, the folks out there doing this work, they're trying to do the best thing to protect homes and communities. They're trying to hit that 100% success rate, and that's what the intent is. And to really manage the risk that is present in our communities from these frequent fire systems. Prescribed fire is the cheapest tool out there. By the way, it is the cheapest, maybe $50 an acre instead of $1,000 an acre for mechanical treatment. When you need to treat millions of acres, that small price difference starts to make a big difference. Are you spending $1,000 or $1,500 an acre to treat, the millions of acres, or are you spending $30 to $50 an acre? It's just a necessary tool in the toolbox to efficiently do this. It also has the best ecological benefits in terms of mimicking the natural process. So prescribed fire just has to continue to be a tool in the toolbox that we use in the right time, right place, as we go forward and protect our homes and communities.
Thank you both for your time today. And thank you as well for all of your work that you've given to the Forest Service.
Thank you.
Thank you as well. Appreciate it.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode. To learn more about our section, please visit our website at www.americanbar.org/environ. Please check where you found us for future episodes. Thank you for listening.